Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 1 of the second round playoff series between the San Jose Sharks and the Colorado Avalanche, in which the Sharks managed to win 5-2, an identical score that the Sharks managed to win Game 1 of in the Vegas series, also 5-2. So the Sharks were coming off, obviously, a 7-game series, so they only had a couple days rest. The Avalanche coming off of a 5-game series, so they had, I think, over a week's rest. And there were a couple other series in the NHL that had similar play out. The Bruins and Columbus, Bruins being the team that played 7, and the Hurricanes Islanders, the Hurricanes being the team that played 7 there. And in the Bruins game, the Bruins came out dominating in the first period, and the Blue Jackets had to catch up as the game went on. The Hurricanes started off that first period very, very well, and the Islanders had to catch up. Both those teams won their games. In this one, it played out a bit differently. While the Sharks had the advantage in the first couple of shifts, the Avalanche got the first goal just a few minutes in, with Bourque getting his basically first point of the entire playoffs, and so it didn't start off too well for the Sharks, especially since after that the Avalanche controlled the decent amount of pace in this first period. They managed to get one back after a nice play by Brent Burns to set up Gustav Nyquist in the middle to tie it 1-1, and that was the score at the end of the first period. At the start of the second period, the Avalanche continued to control the pace of this game. They got a power play goal from Colin Wilson to lead it 2-1, and then they drew a 4-minute cross-checking penalty where Dylan cross-checked for whatever reason JT Compher in the face, caused him to bleed, so it was a 4-minute penalty, and the Sharks managed to not give up 4 goals on this 4-minute penalty. They gave up a total of 0, which ends up being a huge momentum swing for the San Jose Sharks as they begin to take over that game. It starts with Joe Thornton's goal on a 2-on-1 off a pass from Sorensen. Then a beautiful play by Kevin Labanc going through the legs of Mikko Rantanen, cut to the middle, beautiful shot to make it 3-2 San Jose, and at that point they never gave up the lead. Brent Burns added to it late in the second period to make it 4-2, and as the Sharks have done before, as the Sharks actually did a couple times against the Golden Knights in games 1 and 5, they hold a lead coming into the third period. They don't give the Avalanche much of anything in terms of chances, and Timo Meier caps it off with the empty net goal. Now, of course, there are a couple of red flags here for this Sharks game 1, not in terms of necessarily bad play besides the fact that they didn't start too well, but because of the fact that, as I said, the Sharks also won game 1 of that Golden Knights series 5-2, and what happened after that? Well, the Sharks lost games 2, 3, and 4 and fell behind 3-1 in the series. And if that's not scary enough and, making you feel like maybe this 1-0 lead isn't that secure, the Avalanche also lost game 1 of their first round series in a shutout against the Calgary Flames, and then they managed to win games 2, 3, 4, and 5 to end up winning that series in 5 games. So the Sharks, it's a nice advantage that they have this game 1 in the bag at the moment, but it's still anybody's series, and if the Sharks were to take anything from that game, from that series against the Golden Knights, it should be that game 1, winning that game 1 does not secure your spot in the next round necessarily. A few early observations about this series, and mostly in comparison to the series against the Golden Knights. The Avalanche, as it shows on my lineup board, they are separated, Landeskog, McKinnon, and Rantanen, and they started this game as such, Kerfoot playing on that first line, but the Avalanche were very, very quick to put the 3 back together. We saw it when the Sharks tied it up 1-1 in the last few minutes of the first period. They immediately put those 3 back together. When the Sharks were leading, I think, 3-2 in the second period, the 3 of them were immediately back together. For the last 12 or 13 minutes of the third period, that was a line going. So the Avalanche certainly not hesitating to put those 3 players together to try and get some offensive zone time, and it worked out in terms of the zone time. It didn't work out in terms of the goals for those 3 players, but extremely dangerous then. They looked as such in this game. Another thing, I thought Erik Karlsson would end up being a liability in this series, but that hasn't been the case because the Sharks have been sending out the pairing of Vlasic and Burns when playing against Landeskog, McKinnon, and Rantanen when the 3 of them are together, and that pairing has looked solid. And so Erik Karlsson has been playing against, I guess you could say, lesser players, and hasn't really been getting abused as much as he was in the Golden Knights series, because of course if the Sharks send out their top pairing against Smith, Marchessault, and Karlsson, Then Carlson was facing off against the line of Stone, Stasny, and Pacioretty, not really optimal in the situation that Carlson is in. And if the first pairing was going against that Stone line, well, then Carlson was, of course, facing the Marchessault line. So it was sort of like a lose-lose situation defensively for the San Jose Sharks because Carlson is having issues, but he ended up having a solid game because he didn't really have to go up against that Landeskog line. So that big liability I thought the Sharks might have on defense going into this series may not exist as much as we think, at least on home ice. Of course, home ice gives you the fact that you're playing in front of your fans and everything like that, but a huge advantage that you get, especially a huge advantage in the playoffs, is that you get to send on your players last. So DeBoer has the ability to see who Bednar, the coach of the Colorado Avalanche, is sending on the ice, and the Sharks can respond. And so every time they saw that first line coming on, they could easily send on the Couture, Meyer, Nyquist line with the duo of Vlasic and Burns to try and stop them. Once the Sharks do get to Colorado, they lose that luxury, and as such, if the Avalanche see, let's say the Sharks throw on Carlson and Dillon and maybe like the fourth line or the third line, the Avalanche will have the luxury of putting on that first line and trying to abuse that. So it's a great thing to have at home at the moment, but they will have to be a bit more careful on the road. We'll see how Erik Karlsson fares in that scenario, because I would bet that the Avalanche will try and target him, because we saw Karlsson was out late in this third period against that top line after Bednar makes a nice little coaching maneuver, and we saw Karlsson sort of get walked around by Rantanen very close to ending up in the back of the net. First thing to talk about would be second thing after the observations would be Martin Jones. He had a pretty solid game, honestly, tonight. I didn't think it was stealing the game level like in Game 6 against the Golden Knights, but I also didn't think it was shaky but still winning like it was Game 1 against the Golden Knights. I felt like it was sort of like Game 5, his performance, a solid performance, made a couple of very nice saves, one on a breakaway against Soderberg, a good glove save, I think it was against Landeskog or against Barrie. The Sharks players did a great job blocking shots in front of him. I wouldn't really blame him for the Wilson goal, as that was a nice tip in front. There was definitely a question on the Bourque goal, because of course it looked like a bad rebound, but they went over in the first intermission, the analysts and the channel I was watching, and they showed that Gambrell actually tips this puck up high, which caused it to go in a different trajectory. Jones is unable to control the rebound as such, so I don't really blame him for that one. Otherwise, he was pretty solid, and so that's basically all the Sharks need. I mean, everyone coming into this series was saying Jones just has to play at an above average level. He didn't have to be a world beater. He didn't have to be a Bobrovsky. He didn't have to be a Tuukka Rask. He just had to be solid, and that's what he was in this game, and hopefully what he will be going forward. Next is Burns and Vlasic. As I mentioned, they were the pairing that was getting the majority of the minutes against Landeskog, McKinnon, and Rantanen. And while they couldn't limit completely the chances, I don't think there's any pairing in the league that could limit those three players. McKinnon's so skilled, Rantanen and Landeskog no slouches themselves either. But Burns and Vlasic actually did a very good job of limiting what they could possibly do, and they did not get any even strength goals off. They did get the power play goal, but no even strength. Vlasic now 5-0 in games that he has played the entirety of in these playoffs. He was absolutely fantastic defensively once again here tonight. He's really back to that Mark Edward Vlasic level that he didn't seem to find a lot during the regular season. And Burns himself, it was a very classic Burns game. I think he had 4 points tonight, so a huge game offensively. There's a lot more open ice to work with than there was against the Golden Knights, so that works in Burns' favor. Also made a couple of very nice defensive plays with the stick. As usual, the stick checks. He dove out and then brought his stick back to block a pass from Tyson Barrie on a 2-on-1 that was with McKinnon, so an extremely dangerous 2-on-1 that Burns was able to thwart, but in typical Burns fashion as well. Couple bad giveaways in his defensive zone, I think both to Rantanen. He also got walked around by Rantanen on the goal that got called off for the Avalanche because it was kicked in. And so not the perfect game from Brent Burns, but it was basically the usual Brent Burns game, and you'll take that when you can, because he wasn't at times very effective in the Golden Knights series because there wasn't a lot of open ice, but he had a very solid game here in Game 1. Next is Redill and Gambrell, and you might be wondering why the two are mentioned together. They don't play on the same line as each other. There's nothing really associating them besides, I guess, they're the last two forwards. But Redill had what Gambrell's spot was in this game in Game 7 against the Golden Knights, and Redill was just completely terrible. But because of the fact that Joe Pavelski got injured in that game and Donskoy wasn't back for this one, Radil ended up getting a spot on the second line with Kane and Hurdle, and he actually performed quite well in that situation. I really liked him on the forecheck. He did a good job. He has a big body, so he was able to fit in well with Kane and Hurdle, and they didn't get a goal, I don't believe this line did, but they got a lot of solid chances. Radil ended up missing an open net, which was unfortunate for him. Could have taken a 5-2 lead and maybe put that game away. But he still looked quite good, and taking Radil's spot from that Game 7 was Dylan Gambrell, and I don't know if this spot is cursed or maybe if it was a coincidence, because Gambrell himself had a completely terrible game. He takes the penalty that leads to the Wilson goal, was sort of responsible, in fact, for the Bork goal for the Avalanche, and so it was not a good game for Gambrell. We'll see if the Sharks can get back Donskoy or Haley or somebody for Game 2, because Gambrell clearly didn't work out in this one, and I do wonder if they do get back someone like Donskoy. Of course, if they get back Haley, he'll take the spot on the fourth line. But if they do get back Donskoy, I wonder if he'll take the second line spot, or if DeBoer was, happy enough with Radil's performance that Radil will at least keep the second line spot for the start of the game. Finally, I will mention the third line for the Sharks. Of course, this was the big line here for the Sharks in this game. They got goals 2, 3, and 4. All three of those in the second period, which really turned the game around. I guess technically they didn't get the fourth goal, but they were on the ice for it, and it was basically set up by them. It was Brent Burns' goal in the end, however. But it was a very solid game for them against the Golden Knights. The Golden Knights had such depth that the third line didn't get too much of an opportunity to abuse them as much as you'd like to see this third line do, because they're so skilled. Because the fact the Golden Knights were running with two very good first two lines, as well as a decently solid third line that featured a player like Alex Tuck, who's quite solid himself. So the third line didn't really have much room to operate. Here in this series against the Avalanche, they've got that first line, they've got a solid second line, but it sort of falls off on the third line, and the Sharks definitely don't fall off when it comes to the third line. So Thornton, Sorensen, LeBanc, a ton of space. LeBanc has a ton of confidence after that Game 7, even though he didn't start off the series against the Golden Knights too well. Thornton looked very, very good tonight. Sorensen looked solid tonight. So all in all, a great game for that third line, something that we were hoping to see coming into the playoffs and we didn't get too much of in the first round. But in the second round, it's looking very good for them. That will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Sunday, as of course that will be Game 2 against the Avalanche. As I said, Sharks still need to be wary of the fact that the Avalanche came back from down 1-0 to win 4-1, and the fact that they lost the next 3 games after going up 1-0 against the Golden Knights. They'll hope to get the 2-0 here at home, because it's going to be very necessary because of the advantage the Avalanche will have as the last change at home for them in Games 3 and 4. Class dismissed.